Our psalm lesson this morning is a prayer for deliverance, as Gloria said, but it's also a lament, much like people in poverty today might pour out. All around them, the wicked continue to persecute the poor and reap financial rewards in the process. Greedy slumlords take advantage of a tight housing market and raise the rent, then evict them if they can't pay. The rich get richer and think their prosperity has no consequences for the poor. They imagine themselves immune to God's justice. The psalmist speaks for countless generations of underprivileged people who beg the Lord to turn the tables and vindicate their lives. The situation seems hopeless, but as Betsy assured us 2 weeks ago in preaching on Psalm 137, when we raise our voices in anger and pain to God, our compassionate Lord will answer. In the psalmist's words today, the Lord will hear the desire of the meek, will strengthen their heart, and do justice for the orphan and the oppressed. Many centuries later, the Apostle Mark adds his testimony that the divine nature is one of compassion and justice for all people. In our gospel text, a weary Jesus looks upon the ragtag crowd that continues to pursue him and chooses their welfare over his and that of his disciples, for they too are poor and oppressed, in need of a shepherd who cares about their welfare. Even today, 2,000 years later, God's compassion is active and effective in our own lives, for we are both recipients of that compassion and instruments of its application in this world. So listen now to the word of the Lord from Mark 6. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all they had done and taught. He said to them, "Come away to a deserted place, all by yourselves, and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. As he went ashore, Jesus saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. When it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now very late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy something for themselves to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, "Are we to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves have you? Go and see." When they had found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then he ordered them to get all the people to sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and of 50s. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. Those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Summertime and the living is easy. At least for us retired folks. Maybe not so much for parents of school-age children. You've been busy all summer trying to fill the childcare gap left by those hardworking teachers who decided to take the summer off. You've cobbled together this patchwork of day camps, play dates, church camps, swim lessons, plus working from home a day or two here and there. You've been lining up carpools, getting the right food and gear packed every morning, making sure your child isn't the last one picked up from every activity. It's all so much more daunting than your school year routine. You really could use some time away from all that chaos. You and the disciples are in the same boat, so to speak. They had been out on their first missionary journeys, learning and preaching and healing and walking a lot. Now they want to set a spell and debrief what just happened to them. They long for Jesus to minister to them. But the needs of the crowd get in the way, because as soon as Jesus saw the crowd, he had compassion for them. It was in his nature to care for the least and lost who were attracted to his message and his healing power. I like to think the writer of Psalm 10 would have been in good company there, overcome as she was by adversity and oppression. But the disciples weren't quite as favorably disposed as to this interruption as Jesus was. They were justifiably hosed that this scruffy crowd intruded on their Jesus and me moment. Not only were they tired and hungry, but this wasn't really what they signed on for. Back at the Sea of Galilee, the disciples were recruited to go on a road trip with a dynamic and compelling prophet, not to deal with the riffraff following him. Maybe they saw themselves as students, soaking up the teacher's wisdom, and then going back to their everyday lives, a little more enlightened, but just as provincial. Fat chance. First, a mission trip with no training, and now a feeding program in the wilderness. Definitely beyond their pay grade. They're just working stiffs with no fancy credentials for ministry and no miraculous powers. Why me? Why us? The crowd is so needy and the disciples have so little. It's not like they have the financial resources of a hedge fund manager or a real estate tycoon. And there's no Trader Joe's or 7-Eleven around the corner to get provisions, even if they did have the savings of a lifetime. Send them away. That's their sensible suggestion. But Jesus will have none of that. Class is still in session when it comes to being apostles, the sent out ones. They're forced to gird their loins, gather a second wind, and learn some more about following the master, which doesn't involve him doing all the work. Call it the origin of on-the-job training. Jesus doesn't say, "Stand back, boys, and see how it's done." No, Jesus says, "You give them something to eat." Now the crowd has become their burden. But that's not what Jesus had in mind. It's not all on their shoulders. Jesus sends them into the midst of the people to assess what resources might be available from those they are called to serve. What a concept. How often are we overwhelmed by the deficits we see in the needy crowd around us? Especially in low-income neighborhoods, the emphasis is often on all the things that are lacking among the people who live there. Food deserts, inadequate housing, limited transportation, poor school attendance, piles of trash, health struggles, intermittent incarceration, hopelessness, and negativity. But there's another perspective, one that's embodied in the concept called broad-based organizing. This perspective focuses on the assets of the residents, as Woody was saying, recognizing the deep worth and giftedness of each human being, regardless of their living situation. When these capacities are assessed and built upon, the people themselves are able to take action to improve the circumstances of their collective lives. It's not on our shoulders to provide for all their needs. In fact, the iron rule in organizing is don't do for others what they can do for themselves. They have the capacity to work together for their common good. So the disciples do their own inventory of neighborhood assets and come up with 5 loaves and 2 fish. A little meager, admittedly, but Jesus takes them and blesses them and breaks them as though for an ample supper among friends. And he gives the food to the disciples to set before the people, reinforcing their role as leaders. The disciples are partners in this impossible enterprise, transforming the situation with Jesus' coaching. What makes it even more possible is that Jesus directs the disciples to have the crowd sit down in groups on the green grass, groups of 50 and 100. In that moment, the faceless crowd becomes a community. Reverend Jeffrey Crable describes the impact of that action like this. Picture a supply truck arriving in a refugee camp, the hungry crowd gathering as a frenzied pack to get their share of the scarce resources before they quickly disappear. But in the other scenario, the dynamics are altogether different. Sitting in a circle, you connect with those around you. As you pass the bread from person to person, aware of how many people it has to feed, you are less likely to take more than your share, both because you can see the faces of those around you and because the collective will of the group would not allow anything else. You can imagine that those who might have had a little extra tucked away, afraid to share with the hungry crowd, now are more willing to add theirs to the collective pot, knowing that there will be enough for them too. At the outset, the disciples assume the hungry crowd is helpless and must either be dispersed with their needs ignored or become dependent on the social service of the disciples. Jesus instead teaches them how to organize the crowd into a community and how to look more deeply to discover the abundant resources already present. Resources the crowd itself may never have known they existed. There's another important dynamic at work here, the silo syndrome. The disciples imagine that the crowd's needs will only be met if each person fends for him or herself. They picture each individual as a silo, isolated from their neighbors. Jesus is determined to break through that sense of isolation. He pushes the disciples into relationship because that's how they can be genuine in their work alongside others. Relationships are the building blocks of community, and in that context, resources flow. That's the nature of organizing. People are taught the art of relational meetings, the intentional act of listening to one another, to the other person, to share their deep passions, and offering your own at the same time. Out of these meaningful interactions with people of diverse backgrounds comes the discovery of common interests upon which to act. That approach comes hard for us. Church people are conditioned from birth, I think, to offer charity wherever we spot a need. Kids without pencils and paper, we start a school supply drive, and while we're at it, why not provide backpacks to put them in? Homeless people sleeping in the freezing cold, we open a warming shelter to get them inside. Mothers in the neighborhood who have to decide between food for their families and diapers for their babies, we have a diaper campaign. These are important efforts for sure. Sometimes it's the key to survival, but we are the ones upon whom the services depend. Lone rangers, burden bearers. More significantly, these ministries of charity are based on meeting neighbors at their point of need. It's a limited way of relating to others that tips the balance of power our way. But in organizing, or development as we call it, we form relationships at the point of strength. Organizers don't catalog deficits, we add up assets. We don't imagine we are the only ones with leadership skills. We identify and train new leaders. The premise is that every community has leaders who are capable of acting on their own behalf in relationship with others. In the West Central neighborhood where Woody and I are working, the Episcopal Mission has a free dinner every Wednesday for anyone in the neighborhood. It's a mixed group. Some folks who've lived in the same house for decades, some who live in tents in someone's yard, some who live on the street or in a culvert. No one thought they could be organized, much less have gifts to share. Well, one night after dinner, one of the pastors asked people to stick around afterwards if they were interested in working on issues that affected the neighborhood. Over the following 4 weeks, a total of 25 or 30 people met and discussed the things that would make the most difference in their current situation. They shared stories from their own lives and made lists of the most important issues. Then they all got colored dots, you know them, to stick on the charts next to the hottest issues and the ones they were willing to work on. That was an empowering thing in itself. Affordable housing came out on top by a landslide, and so the group, the community, put their heads together and decided that one step they could take was to identify the zombie houses in the 20-block area around the mission. Once those were identified, they might be able to find a way to return those houses to the marketplace where they could be rented by folks like themselves. 3 walkabouts were organized and 29 derelict houses were cataloged. Then they got a meeting with the city official in charge of affordable housing ventures. And these people, who had never been organized or acknowledged as having a voice, spoke directly to the city official. And he listened to them. Shorty and Elisa and Chris with a K and Chris with a C. And he heard what they had to say. And he offered suggestions. They now understand that change is possible, and they can be the instruments of that change. Our Beyond Relief group here at Hamlin has also recognized the limitations of charity alone. We're working to build relationships within the church and in the community around us, so we might find ways to bring about positive systemic change. Ours is an ever-expanding group, and we welcome the curious and committed. In today's society, we've become more and more isolated, which paralyzes the ability of ordinary people to act together. But isn't the church uniquely positioned to counteract that trend? What other institution in our society is built on the ethic of community and has the people power, the passion, and the divine mandate from Jesus to go out into the world and make a difference? Jesus taught us how to build relationships, identify assets, and organize a once faceless crowd. We are the modern day apostles, the sent out ones, the ones who respond when Jesus says, "Go and see what you have." As followers of Jesus, we are motivated by Jesus' compassion for the least and the lost. But it doesn't stop there. Jesus gave us a blueprint for acting on that compassion. Jesus trained lay people to be leaders. Jesus challenged his disciples to find the assets and the needy people around them. Jesus instructed his followers to get personal with the people they were serving, and Jesus had them divide themselves into communities. There was a phenomenal alchemy at work when all those elements were blended together and Jesus' powerful presence. It produced a miracle far greater than feeding a crowd of people a single meal. Marriott can do that. Jesus is in it for the long haul. And when we follow his model of ministry, we are carrying on a heritage that has been passed down from generation to generation. When we answer 5 loaves and 2 fish, can we expect anything less than a miracle? Let us pray.